D4T went out to 30,000 patients in an observational study, which was able to pull out small and moderate side effects in the drugs for the NDA application that went before the FDA. So activists said, look, clinical trials are all good and well, but we need another process to serve the needs of our communities. And we came up with the idea of parallel track. So we weren't all Sturm und Drang. We were doing our homework, and we were trying to figure out ways to reform the clinical trial system. And parallel track was a key way we did that, both with DDI and D4T, which Bristol Myers gave out to tens of thousands of patients around the country during the early days of the epidemic, before the drug was approved. Everybody knows about these right-to-try laws that we see popping up in every state nowadays. The laws are already on the books. We don't need a right to try. We already have it. And I said to you that earlier on we had this idea that any drug was better than no drug, and a new drug is certainly better than any old drug. What we realized soon into the AIDS epidemic is that maybe this need for speed and early access was playing against our best interests. And we realized with D4T, which was a nucleoside analog for HIV, the first generation kind of drugs we had for AIDS, that this drug and the whole class of drugs that we had weren't really that good in terms of the clinical outcomes we saw in patients. And they could move surrogate markers like CD4 up and down, maybe by 10, 20 CD4 cells, but we didn't really have an idea about how to use these drugs. And all of a sudden, these screaming AIDS activists who are shutting down the FDA are saying, wait a second, maybe we have to think about the ways to get access to drugs, parallel track, but also get answers about drugs. So I happened to be on the FDA advisory committee for D4T, and we went around there when we voted whether we were going to approve it, and I said no. Why? Because yes, it would be great to have a new AIDS drug on the market, but I didn't believe the confirmatory trial would have any ability to show that this drug had a clinical effect beyond the surrogate marker effect it showed in those early trials, and it turned out to be right. And when the new drugs came around, the protease inhibitors, which revolutionized HIV treatment, we said we're not going to make this mistake again. And we advocated with the research community for something called large simple trials. Not to rely on surrogate markers anymore, but to really definitively tell us if this new generation of drugs had an actual clinical effect. Luckily, and to our great fortune, the protease inhibitors turned out to be blockbusters that didn't need a large simple trial to prove that they had enormous clinical benefits. But we'd gone from being critics of the FDA, sort of blindly calling for new medicines to be on the market with very little testing, which you hear a lot about nowadays. You've heard of a drug called Sarepta, which was approved in maybe a dozen to 2 dozen patients about 6 months ago at the FDA because kids with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy need it. We learned that early promise doesn't mean actual clinical benefit for patients, and we sort of reformed our ways. After we got done with the FDA, we went to the NIH, and again, now the NIH has a big fence around it. It didn't have a big fence around it back then. When thousands of people stormed Building 1 at the NIH campus in Bethesda and took over the campus, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's still the head of NIAID, actually at that time was meeting with activists to talk about how he could integrate them into research. So engagement in research was happening 30 years ago, and it was being called for from the inside, not just from outsiders who were storming the gates of the Citadel. And again, we were very good at protests, and still are, but we also said, you know what, it doesn't matter that we're not PhDs and MDs. We can understand research. We just have to put our nose to the grindstone and do it. And we found mentors, whether they're biostatisticians or virologists or clinical researchers, and we said, help us think about how we look at research. And in Montreal, we put out a national AIDS treatment agenda, which basically challenged the NIH to rethink about how it organized AIDS research and what its priorities were. A couple of years later, we did something called the Count in 18 Months project, where we said, you know what? You've been spending all your money on AZT, DDI, DDC, D4T with not too much avail. Why not focus on the opportunistic infections that kill most people living with HIV at that time? And we had allies who were infectious disease docs and others who said, yeah, this makes sense. And we went together to the NIH and said, look, you need to boost funding into opportunistic infections research. So this is a kind of engagement which took enormous sort of dedication and interest. But, you know, I was a college dropout. Most of my friends had no scientific backgrounds. We taught ourselves because it was life and death to us. You know, we got even a little more serious. We went to the entire NIH AIDS research portfolio and said, where are the gaps, where are the redundancies, is it being well managed? And guess what? It wasn't. NIH AIDS research takes place across the institutes in over a dozen institutes and centers, and we said we need a more sort of cohesive, organized way to do AIDS research at the NIH. And Senator Kennedy and Representative Waxman and the new President Clinton said, yeah, we agree, and we passed the bill through Congress to reorganize AIDS research at the NIH. This is just to say that we can transform medical research and drug development in revolutionary ways. And it's beyond PCORI, it's beyond NIH, it's beyond CDC, it's beyond FDA. But it takes sort of a commitment to learning the science, building allies and partnerships, and not being afraid to sort of act up. Now, I'll end with this, because I think we're in a little bit of a pickle here, because in order to do this, we need to invest in independent patient advocacy groups who are funded to learn the science, to understand all the details of how clinical trials are supposed to be done, and then be able to sort of hold drug companies' feet to the fire about when they're not doing the right thing on their part of the drug development bargain. But the New England Journal of Medicine showed earlier this month that more than 80% of patient groups accept drug funds and have members of drug companies on their boards. So if we're going to create an independent community of people, of patients, we're all patients in this room. Everybody has a disease or has a loved one disease. If we're going to be engaged in the research process, we're going to have to create an independent community that's independently funded to do this work. And I think it showed through the HIV epidemic and our subsequent successes in tuberculosis and hepatitis C and the work we've done that this can change minds and it can change science. And so I'll leave you with that, that this may be old history, but it may point towards a new way to think about patient engagement beyond the sort of formalism that we've heard about in some of the documents that come out of the NIH or PCORI or other places. Thank you.